Hello, everybody. Thank you for your patience. We've had to work through some technical difficulties this afternoon, some of it apparently weather related, which is something I experience myself in my own semi-rural location occasionally. So it's my pleasure to introduce Bryce Robinson, whom many of you know. Bryce has just finished a term on the board of directors of WFO, where his experience as an illustrator and his technical capabilities have been well used. Bryce is currently a graduate student at Cornell in the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, working on his PhD. He has many publications already, many of them illustrated with his own illustrations. He's worked on across North America and and in the Arctic. And without further ado, I'll just go ahead and turn it over to Bryce. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks everyone. And sorry about my earlier presentation and it not working out. But I'm at the Lab of Ornithology now with hopefully better internet and things will go smoothly. I thought I would start out with a short PowerPoint presentation. Hopefully you all can see this. I just wanted to give everybody a view of how I use illustration in the work that I do and the utility of illustrating birds as a way to familiarize yourself with birds and bird ID and as a communication tool. I also wanted to introduce how I illustrate birds, and it's a concept that you can take out into the field with you and use to put together an illustration of the birds that you're observing and studying in the field. But it's also a concept that you can use in the studio by using photos, a photo pool as your source material. So to start, I just want to show some examples of the work that I've done, particularly here as part of being a board member and using my skills to help the organization, Western Field Ornithologists, by giving painting this Sabin's goal for the 50-year badge. It's a pleasure of mine to be able to help organizations with their branding. I've had quite a bit of opportunities to do that, from the AOS conference in Anchorage in 2019 to Partners in Flight groups and other nonprofits that are doing conservation work. And I really have enjoyed this aspect of my illustration. But I've also had the privilege of contributing my illustrations to some of my work as an ornithologist. I don't know how many times an illustration's been on the cover of Western Birds, but I was very pleased to see my gray crown rosy finch show up on the cover of recent Western Birds that featured the feature article detailing some of the observations we had on St. Matthew Island in the Bering Sea on an expedition I was privileged to be on. I've also, my illustrations have showed up in Western Birds on other occasions, particularly this note that I wrote with my good friend Luke DeSico, who you just heard from, detailing the first record of Eurasian barn swallow breeding in North America. And I use my illustration skills to help communicate or help support our identification of the birds that we photographed there on the right. There are many other ways that I've used illustration to provide an artful touch to figures, but also more readily communicate what the figure is about. Particularly, when you look at a histogram, the words are there showing fork-tailed storm petrel, but anyone familiar with that species will look at it and immediately know that they're looking at data for fork-tailed storm petrel. I've had the privilege of, illustrating figures for a number of raptor papers that I've been co-author on. But I've also had the privilege to illustrate for in the guidebook style, which I think is the most fun. It's what I think most into as an illustrator, is trying to correctly capture and communicate the plumage aspects that are important for identifying species or subspecies. I'm currently working on a revision to the Zona Tropical guidebook to the birds of Costa Rica. I'm in charge of revising all the raptor plates, and here's a few of them that I've finished so far. Hopefully I'll have this project finished sometime soon, and I'll be sharing more as I go along. And I think you were able to see this before the internet cut out, but these are flickers that I illustrated for this presentation that I unfortunately couldn't finish, but to communicate the work that I'm doing and trying to describe the prevalence of red nuchal crescents in red-shafted flicker. So tonight I want to show you how I create this illustration of a red-shafted flicker from a photo pool. But the concept that I'm introducing here is, I call it, it's kind of a dorky name, but I call it building a bird. And essentially it's a concept that you can take into the field and you can use while you're observing foraging shorebirds. I've used it to try and illustrate in the field foraging shorebirds, foraging buntings on the coast. And essentially what you do is you get an image in your head, and generally if I'm trying to illustrate something to communicate ID aspects, it's going to be in this pretty typical guidebook style where it's wing on from the side, profile, capturing all aspects of the bird to more comprehensively show plumage aspects and shape and everything of the bird. So you can keep this posture, this shape in mind, and you can watch a bird or look at a number of photos and put together a bird that you, as you go along. And when you're observing birds in the wild, you just watch a bird until you see it in that posture. You see an aspect that you're trying to capture at that moment. So right now, I think if anybody wants to follow along and pull out a pad and a paper, I invite you to do that. I will stop sharing this screen and we'll switch to the other camera that I have here that's pointed at my canvas on the table here, and I'll go through how I approach this. So Jen, I'm seeing John Harris conference chair as my main thing on my computer. Can we switch that to my Illustrator?
Just a moment. We can do that. Did that change it?
Now it's on you for me.
Oh, that's interesting. Let's see. How about that?
Yes, that works.
Okay.
And so what I'm using some photos, a number of photos from Macaulay Library right now as my source material. But just remember, you can actually do this on a live bird that's being confiding just by watching it. Before I get started, I want to go through. I want to first show, this is the original painting of those illustrations that I included in my talk. And I want to show you how I illustrated, how I started creating this image right here. Before I start though, I wanted to show you the tools that I use because that's extremely important in this. I feel like in illustrating birds and in painting birds, just choosing the right tools can make your images that much better. I use drafting pencils for my sketching. I generally start with this 0.9 pencil, and that's just a broad width on the lead that I start shaping the bird lightly. And then I use this 0.5 to go in, and the lines that I like, I darken, and this one refines it. I almost erase things more than I put marks down on the page. The more you're particular in your illustrating, and the more you don't move on until you think it's correct what you've done, the better your illustration is going to be. And the more you learn as you go along, the more efficient you are. But for my erasing, I have two different erasers here that are like this, so that I can get a good grip and I can do some detailed erasing. I have this broad one where I can erase quite a bit at one time. Sometimes I have a larger gum eraser too, if I just want to completely clear the page and start over. This can be extremely useful for getting proportion and shape right, whether it's in the field using it. I'm not sure if you've heard of the trick of holding it out, holding a pencil out or something, and gauging the the relative size of one body part to the other by holding it at arm's length out like this, if you can see my speaker camera, and just sizing up relative parts of a bird that's maybe perched or sleeping. You can get the proportion and shape correct through that. It's also really useful for getting relative proportions correct for museum specimens if you're illustrating from a museum specimen, and photos as well. If you say you are building your bird and you know that the general length of the bird is, say, this big, and you want to know if the length is that, how big is the head, then you can use this tool to help make sure you get that correct. So I'm constantly using all of these tools. So I'm actually going to turn this like this because if you remember, I'm illustrating a flicker as if it's perched on the ground, feeding in the grass. I really like that posture because from the side, because it shows a lot of the aspects of the flicker that I needed to illustrate to communicate the differences between Aratus and Kaffir, for instance. So I'm gonna switch to my reference material. And Jen, I don't know if this will work, but when I've done this in the past, it is difficult for me to carry on a conversation and illustrate. So sometimes I might go a little silent for a little bit, but I do think that I can carry on a conversation if people want to ask questions as I'm illustrating. So if we can do that, that's totally fine with me. If not, that's fine as well.
That should be fine. I will watch the Q&A window, and when questions come through, I can just blurt them out.
Okay, sounds good. So one thing that my approach in illustrating generally, my friend Andrew Johnson, who's a collections manager at UNM, he's an illustrator, and he told me that he never illustrates a bird bigger than it is in real life. And I think that that's a pretty good rule of thumb because it's easier to control the correct shape and proportions that way. So I try and do that. And I tried to do that with these flickers. They're almost as big as they are in real life on the page of the paintings that I've already finished. The other thing that I do is that I try and treat my lines and everything as if I had a block of clay, where you start putting down lines and you start playing around with the shape and the posture that you want. And you definitely do this while you're watching a bird too. Just start throwing down stuff, and you'll just work it in as if you're molding a ball of clay. And you're measuring the proportion the relative proportion of the body parts and changing the shape profile as you go along. That's what I'm doing right now. And when I know that something's incorrect or in the way, I just take it out. And I'm gonna try and go quicker. So just because it's hard, I think, to watch someone go slowly as they're illustrating. So this might be a little rough or not refined, but I do want to say that the more particular you are in creating this, the better it will turn out, for sure. So take it slow if you need to.
Bryce, are your erasers Tombro Mono Zero?
Yes,
Thank you.
Tombro Mono Zero. And I really like them. I just started using them about 1.5 years ago, and I'm very glad that I found them and did start using them. So you can see I'm just kind of playing with lines here and seeing what works, and I might take a second to do some checking of the proportion of things. Someone like David Sibley, this part is very quick and easy for him because he spent almost his entire life sketching birds in the field, and he's extremely good at getting the right shape and posture for the birds that he's illustrating.
Debbie House asks, what type of paper are you using?
This is just I think I took I don't know the brand of this, but it's essentially just a finer grain sketching pad. And again, if you spend a little bit more money, it's going to be nicer for you. You can get a better quality, but for the sketching, when I'm doing a painting, I'll talk about this here in a little bit about how I go from a sketch to a painting. It's not so important to have a really nice sketch paper because it's basically a utility. The end product, unless you really want the end product to be a pencil drawing, that's really not something I do very much. So I spend a lot of money on watercolor paper, but not so much on sketch paper. So another trick that I think I have is for getting the posture right. Posture is really important because if your bird is in an odd posture, it won't look natural. It won't look like a real bird, and it's something that I've struggled with a lot over time in learning how best to capture the right posture. Some species are more difficult than others. I find a flicker perched on the ground to be a simpler one. Raptors getting raptor postures correct is extremely difficult. I also find myself having a hard time with passerines for whatever reason. So the other thing that you need to do in order to make a bird look real and recognizable is you need to make sure that you have all of the parts correctly illustrated. Not only have all the parts, but have them, the correct proportion and size. And what I mean by that is, all these birds obviously need wings and tails and legs and stuff. But what I really mean is the correct number of feathers and folded in the correct way, positioned in the correct way, which is a really, just in illustrating it, it gives you, it really strengthens your understanding of the characteristics that make a particular species appear the way it does. And I think that increases your ability to identify birds as well. just by understanding what makes them look the way they look. Feet are another thing that I struggle with. And as you all know, woodpecker feet are quite unique. And it's important to get those correct. Okay, I'm just still taking a step back and thinking about all the parts and where they're at.
Bryce, I have a question from Andrew Gutenberg.
Uh,
He says, I noticed you established a line of the back, the wings, and the nape first. That's the same for me, and I wonder if it's because that's where the bird's spine is, and that's a good anchor for the sketch. Can you talk about that a bit?
yeah, well, if you guys don't know Andrew, he's a very accomplished and skilled illustrator himself. As he mentioned, that's his technique as well. I don't even think about it. I just kind of did it. But I think you're right, Andrew, in that I generally like to strike a line like that just to get the posture, like the position of the bird correct, and know that, okay, I can build the bird around that line. But essentially the back is doing that on something like this, where it's almost straight. The feathers fold a certain way. So yeah, I mean, I think that's correct. It helps you get kind of an anchor for where everything else on the bird is going to lay. So what I was saying about the pieces of the bird and the feathers and everything, bird feathers, they all fall, or they all lay a certain way, and it's purposeful. Take for instance the flight feathers here. The furthest out on the wing, the primaries are the most under. They're the bottom feathers, and every other feather sequentially folds on top of them. So that causes this, when they're folded, that causes this pattern where it's not always the longest primary that's at the end here, but the last one that's showing that is the longest on a folded wing would be the one that's underneath everything else, and that's to protect the most important feathers on a bird. And when you're illustrating, it's important to illustrate it in that way. You need to know what feathers are on top of what feathers, and as you build it, that it then looks natural. So you have all the primaries here, and right here are the tertials that are on top. And then you get into the secondaries, and as you go in, these are on top, and these are all underneath those. And then you get, let's see, I like to draw the scapulars first here to kind of, and then the coverts, greater coverts, and the median coverts here. Now there's a really important thing here that I figured out, years ago in illustrating birds that helps make your bird look real. So the greater coverts, they're like the secondaries in the way they lay. These ones are on top. But here it shifts. So you actually have to illustrate it like this. And I'd like to know what other folks do here, but sometimes it helps to strike some lines about where the feathers are. It is also important if you're doing it if you're illustrating from photos, your bird's not moving around, so you can relax a little bit and take your time. But understanding on this folded wing of a flicker in this posture, how many of these median and lesser upper wing coverts are showing that you need to illustrate. And generally on flickers, sometimes they have some of their feathers here are covering up the wrist of the bird. I think my head shape is a little off. Something about the head is bothering me. I might try and change it a little bit. The feet also. Sometimes I look at, to help know if I have body parts in the right position, I look at where particular body parts lay in relation to other body parts in a particular posture. And in this way, it helps you position things. And I think I've got the feet too far back here. I think the front of the feet need to line up somewhere here. Maybe go somewhere there. That. I think that's better.
I have a question from Diane. She wants to know, are the primary coverts hidden?
Sometimes there's actually all the photos I'm looking at that you can just see where they are, and they generally hit somewhere right here, and they can cause a little bit of a change in the shape of the wing right here. And I do find the primary coverts, I tend to try and hide them because I have a hard time illustrating them correctly, but they lay an interesting way. But if you look at the painting here of the flickers that I did, you can see that they are suggested right here by the black line. So just knowing that that black line there is caused by the primary coverts. So we can do that here, put them in. Stroke that a little bit hard. Another important thing, so let me do the scaps here. And generally the scaps on the flicker, the only important thing is to get, well actually, and most of these coverts, except for say the graders, the shape of the feather is hidden by the coloration. So I'm mapping these out so that I can then make sure that the placement of my banding on the back is in the right spot. I'm probably, and as you can see here, I didn't really accentuate the different feathers here. I might go back and actually toy around that with that a little bit, but generally on flickers, it doesn't show that prominently. Maybe the line here for where the scapulars come up are where the scapulars are covering the wings might be accentuated a little bit, but I'm mostly mapping this to make sure that I put the banding on the back in the right spot, if that makes sense. So when I do the scapulars, I know that the mantle is right here, and the scapular feathers, these ones cover part of the wing, and then these ones cover these. And generally they start out fairly large. And then they get smaller as they go up the back. And then mantle is here. Now on flickers, this spot right here is where there's a break in the plumage pattern. So your banding goes from basically the secondaries here all the way up to here. And then this is where you hit the gray. So let's start building the head a little bit. Getting the position of the eye is really important. If you don't get it in the right spot, your bird looks wacky and not real. So my approach to getting the eye in the right spot is to, you can do some measuring if you have a specimen, or you can use that trick with, on a live bird. But I find thing that really works the best for me is just to plot it and feel it out, and just be, in all of this, be light in your strokes until you know it's correct. And I usually don't start pressing hard until I know that I'm finishing up. But just feel out where the eye is. Where you think the eye looks correct. And you might have to shift it around a little bit, erase it. The other thing about the eye is they are very rarely perfectly circular. So pay attention to the angles on the eye, and you can actually manipulate I'm struggling for the word here, the mood of the bird, or the tone of the bird, just by the way, the shape of the eye. And you can also make it look as if it's looking at the ground, or looking at the observer, or looking in the air, just by the shape of it. Sometimes there's, a little point here, and so just play around with that. I think you'll understand if you just, a lot of these things is just exploring and figuring it out for yourself. The flickers have a really neat bill shape, and I asked my friend, I often send illustrations to my close friends. I don't know if they enjoy it or not, but I'm constantly asking them, does this look right to you? Because I'm not sure. And one thing, I think I had drawn the bill shape on the illustration for the painting I did of these flickers, and gave it this little hump here that I'm trying to do right now. And it kind of drops as it meets the forehead of the bird. And the feedback I got was that it was a little bit too accentuated. So I had to tone it down a little bit. But it is an interesting shape. There's parts of the face that are really important to make sure that you do correctly as the bill meets the body. I always pay attention to where the forehead meets the bill versus where the throat meets the gular area, that's what this is called, meets the lower mandible. In some birds, those meet at the same spot, but in a lot of birds, they don't. And if you don't pay attention to that, your bird will look goofy and incorrect. So you can see on the flicker in this posture that is not the same. The gape, as it comes in, the relative distance of where the gape disappears relative to where the eye is really important. That distance of the lores here is really important. So just pay attention to that as you're illustrating birds. I found that getting that correct can really help make a bird look better. One important aspect that I'm going to do now on the flicker is the mallard, and that's a feather patch. That the important thing here is that you're paying attention how far it extends and the shape of it. I think another critique I had when I sent the illustration to my friend Neil, he said that the mallard looked a little too, I think he used the word geometric or something, but he meant it was too much of just a block. It didn't have any a natural shape to it. That I'm trying to do here. And the mallard on flickers extends about the same as the auriculars right here. And the auriculars are what some people call the cheek patch. They cover where the ear is, right here on the cheek. And the shape of the auriculars and the extent of the auriculars is also something that's extremely important to get right, because it can really change the way that the shape of the head and how the shape of the head appears. I think what I'm seeing here is that my throat might be a little bit too long. So change that a little bit. The nares are important in a lot of species. You know, you have some corvids that have bristles that cover their nares, and that can be important for if you're illustrating something like a Chihuahuan raven versus a common raven. The length of that relative to the total bill length is one of the species differences. One of the features that you can use to identify the species there. So getting that correct is really important, and kind of drives the point that relative proportion of things can be quite important if you're trying to illustrate a bird to communicate identification, for instance. But for these guys, they've got their nostril here at the base of the bill that doesn't stick out too far. I'll just make sure we hint at that. Generally, when I'm drawing or illustrating or sketching a bird for a painting, I don't do anything with the eye. I just leave it as it is now and blank. And that's just to make sure that I have the shape right. If you fill it in, it kind of changes that, because as you can see, the broad edge here, if I darken that, it'll make the eye bigger than maybe I want it. Right now, I'm using this negative space to outline the eye. So I'm gonna just take a look at it, take a step back, take a look at it. And I think I actually like the shape of the eye that I have now. So I'm gonna strike it in with this pencil. And then I can go over it and erase that black line, the broader black line. And then I'm just gonna do this as a demonstration, even though I generally don't do it, but I'll darken the eye and show you when I'm painting the approach I do to make sure that I have a realistic eye. So in all animals, the one thing to help make the animal look alive is to give it a little catch light in its eye. And if you give that, it shows the reflection in the eye and will give the animal life. So I try and map that out before I put any paint down or any darkening down. And then knowing that you start with a mid-level darkening, and then you want to build it in. Your pupil is definitely going to be the darkest spot, as well as the edges, so you can darken that in. I actually might switch to this harder lead so we can. And if you just, in illustration and painting and everything, you're playing with the gradient from white to black to deep black. And if you know, as long as you have that gradient on a painting or an illustration, it's going to look better than just coloring it all one color. I hope that makes sense. So when I illustrate eyes, I try and pay attention to that gradient and make sure I have a broad grade of tones here from deep black all the way to the lightest white mark in the eye. I hope that makes sense. I think I like the head shape, so I'm going to do some striking of lines, and then I'll get rid of the broader, messy lines. I also want to map out the nuchal crescent, because that's important just to know where it is as I use this to paint this, whether auratus or Kaffir. I want to know where that is. In my Kaffir illustration painting here, I did purposefully just put some fleckings of red there. Just purposefully, but I needed to know where to put those, so I would just map it out. And let me just look at it. worry. Just making sure things look right. Let's get rid of some of this stuff. So Jen, I'm just checking to make sure everybody's out there. Haven't heard from you in a little bit.
Yes, it looks like we still have some people out there, but it also looks like we have no questions in the queue.
Cool. Yeah, after my presentation, I was nervous that I had lost you again.
No, it's all good. I don't know if I want to scare you. You've got 73 people in the room with you.
Yeah, you shouldn't tell me that.
You're well loved.
Good.
I do see some feedback in the chat that people are really enjoying the presentation.
Oh, good. I'm happy to hear that. So I'm going to take a step back here and look at things. And to my eye, I think I've got some issues that I need to correct. I think that the wings are too long. The wing projection is too long. So I'm going to erase some of it. I think the tail, there's something going on with the tail here that I need to correct. So I'm just going to retry here. I think it's that line that, let me stand up here for a sec. I think it's the line that Andrew was talking about. Kind of getting into the same spot, but. Okay. I think that's probably better. So the other thing, I'm sure you all know from identifying birds that I'm going to erase this and retry, that the number of primaries that you can see projecting from the wing can help with some species IDs. So in all birds, you should pay attention to those types of details to make sure that it's correct. Let me look at this in these flickers. Generally, yeah, I've illustrated 5 on there, and I think 5 is probably the correct one. And these outer, the longest of these sticking out are quite close to each other. And then it breaks up a little bit. So I'm just going to redo these. Okay. Now, another thing is just to try and get the rest of the shape in. So I don't overdo it.
I have a question from Lena. It says, it seems you're drawing in feather tracts, and they will almost disappear when you fill in the stripes and markings of the finished bird.
Yep.
Is this to get the placement and the angles of the markings correct?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and those subtle like feather tracks will disappear, but it's to get the relative proportion of everything correct. So on these sketches, I mean, if you look at my, I unfortunately I had to come to the lab to do this because of my internet, but in my studio, I have a drawer full of all of my sketches, and I was planning on pulling that out to show you all the different pre-painting sketches that I have that are essentially like show that exact thing that you're talking about, Lena. that all the feather tracks, I draw them all because I want to make sure that they're all relatively correct in their proportion to one another. And they don't disappear. They just kind of fade into the rest of the detail. So from here on out, it differs on the amount of detail I do from here forward versus what I do with paint. But I think I still have a few things to do that are important. The upper tail coverts. I think on flickers, they generally tend, those might be a little too long. I think what I've seen is that they generally tend to go somewhere between when you lose the underwing coverts here and the tip of the primaries. So I think there's somewhere right here. They're also very beautifully patterned. And I had a fun illustrating them here on these. Illustrating tails, I find that to be a difficult thing to capture correctly, and I don't know if I've quite mastered it at all. But the central tail feather is on top, and then going sequentially out, the rest of them fall underneath, so that the outer tail feathers are the most, or the bottom feathers. So. But the way the folding on a completely folded tail, a lot of the feathers get obscured. So I generally don't pay too much attention to showing, on something like a raptor or a flicker that has 12, and you're looking at it from the side. I don't try and make sure there's 6 here, because a lot of the times you can't ever count 6. Because some of them are obscured, especially the outer tail feathers being folded in. But birds in flight, that's definitely a very important thing to make sure that you do correctly, is make sure that you have counted your feathers in the right spot. Okay. Other thing I want to do, maybe strike a line of the rachis here, because there's color along that line. So when I transfer this onto my watercolor paper and I draw that line on the watercolor paper, that'll help me not have to figure that out or do it incorrectly when I'm putting the paint down. Then another thing that I might go back to my paintings that I showed in my presentation and change is that, flicker feet have 2 toes forward and 2 toes behind. And to get it right, it's important to get them in the right position, and the relative lengths are important to making it look like it's a real flicker foot. So this digit here is actually sits on the outside like this, rather than the tarsus going over it. And then there's another one that hides back here that I didn't illustrate on my paintings. You can see it, I'll pull them over. I didn't illustrate it here, but I just, in looking at them again, I think I actually want to go back and put it in, because it'll make it look that much more natural. I remember birding in southern Arizona years ago, and I stayed at a friend's house, and she was an older woman, and she was telling me how one of the things she really hates about David Sibley's paintings is that a lot of the birds only have one leg. And that's just stuck with me for so long, because I didn't want anybody to say that about my illustrations. So I try and figure out in this posture, should I put the second leg in? But oftentimes it's a very difficult thing to do, to know where it should go and everything. And also sometimes in this posture, you really can only see one leg. And that's why Sibley's done that in a lot of his paintings, despite people having critical opinions of it. So the last thing that I could do, and that I sometimes do, but sometimes don't, is plot in with pencil the some of the plumage characters. I did that a little bit with these birds because it's important. So every feather here has a couple of black bands, but when they're all folded, they only one is showing per feather on these covers, for instance. And it doesn't sit at the end here, it kind of sits above here. And so plotting these out will help you make sure that your paint goes in the right spot. So I might do that a little bit. And these markings on every individual feather will give the effect of the banding that you see when you just look at a northern flicker sitting on the grass, even through your binoculars. It'll give it that effect of banding. And as you get up here in the smaller feathers, there's just, so much thinner banding. So you can just plot those out. One thing that I do with raptors, especially when I'm illustrating raptors, is I count the number of bands on the back or on the breast to make sure that I'm not overdoing it, so that it looks exactly like a real bird. So counting, being that particular, is how you make that, just one more step forward in making your illustration look correct. So counting bands is definitely something that I do, and I try to do in every bird, especially in-flight raptors. That helps a lot to make sure they're, species like something like zone-tailed hawk or common black hawk that have a lot more bands on their secondaries when compared to something like a red tail, and it gives it a totally different look. And just including that can make the difference. So these have these bands, and it's not, these bands are not just like a straight line. I'm not just drawing a straight line. They have really unique shape to them, where they meet the center of the feather, the vein here. They might drop down a little bit. In fact, these ones do, and then they get a little bit thinner at the edge. And so paying attention to the shape of some of the markings is also another way to make sure that things are looking correct. Might be a hint of some feathers there. So all this is, let me go through and do these, and you can see, I actually think I did this incorrectly. You see how I've, like this gives the appearance, if I lay them out like that, it gives it the appearance as if it's rolled up like that, and these are flat, when in reality, these start rolling over the bird. So you can give it a little bit of depth by changing the shape of these feathers that are laying on top of one another as they roll over the bird's wing. So these feathers actually are flat here. And then there's 1, 2, that right. 2, 3. And then it starts becoming rolling over and getting a little bit rounded that way instead of this way. And, you know, counting the number of secondaries that are showing is also important. You don't want to do a ton here, but you also don't want to have only 3, right? So counting those will help the bird. Another thing you can do to help make the bird look natural. When I illustrated these here, I did not map the dots out. And when I did this one, I thought, I swore, because I thought I had done too many. There was the last plumage character I started filling in, and I thought I had done too many on this one. Well, I had. There's a little bit too much density in that bird, so that's because I didn't map it out or count spots on some of my reference material. Because as you can imagine, that's quite tedious, and sometimes I am not. Sometimes I get tired, but I should be counting the dots on these birds and mapping them out. The other thing is that you know that these have dots, and they do somewhat follow predictable patterns. So when I'm doing plumage characteristics like spotting on the feathers or banding even, sometimes I draw a leading line to show that the body shape of the bird and how those bands or spotting should be organized as you go along the bird. There's, it's not even just like this. Let me redo that. It doesn't just follow the same shape. It actually changes as it rounds around the breast of the bird. And I'll try and capture that. So here you get very thin bands, but they actually start to come to a center point up here. Yeah, I'm not doing it very well. And just plotting those in that way can help you get some dimension to the bird that gives it some shape and makes it look that much better. So now I have these leading lines where I can start putting down some of the spotting. And the spotting does follow somewhat linear, but it is a little disorganized. Because, birds' feathers, especially breast feathers, contour feathers, they can manipulate them. So they fluff up and change, and they can be blown around. So that can actually be somewhat forgiving for you trying to get it correct, but sometimes it does look messy and not as organized. I think that these are too far apart, and also too dense here. So I'll think about that. And then these ones aren't exactly circle, they're more flat because they're starting to round around the bird. Then back here, the spotting, it can change if it's covered up, but some of them can be covered up by other feathers, and so they can look more like bands, even though they're still larger spots. They're just covered up by larger feathers on top of them. Get a little bit looser there. This one. Let's clean this up a little bit. The lines are bothering me because they're making it look a way that it's not supposed to look. I'll just clean that up a little bit, see if I like where the spots are. The other reason to map it out instead of painting it is you can erase it and retry, and you're actually saving yourself a lot of time and effort just by being particular in that way. The last thing I need to do is the undertail covered pattern, which is kind of a strange one. It's somewhat banded, somewhat spotted still. But from the side, it looks like a little bit like banded. So we'll just put some down. And again, every feather covers up the one going this way. So some of them look like bands because half of the spot is covered. Okay. And then the upper tail cover pattern is really neat. I'll just strike it in a little bit. Just to give a hint at it. Okay. Well, I think, I mean, I could sit here and keep tinkering. But just looking at this, I think that this is the point where I would take my transfer paper or tracing paper rather, not transfer paper. I use tracing paper and I trace the bird and all the aspects that are important that I've done here. And I transfer it onto watercolor paper so that I can then start painting it. So I don't know how many illustrators do this, but I don't just grab watercolor paper and start painting. I spend half the time in creating an illustration is spent doing what you're seeing me do right now. Oh, and another thing, I really like the effect of, I just really like guidebooks. And so I want to draw like guidebooks, but you know, having a bird on just a bird with nothing else on a sheet of paper is a bit unnatural. And I haven't done it here, but I like to put a shadow, just, you know, just a hint of the ground to ground these birds. You know, and some illustrators do more than that. Some do not put anything, but sometimes just a gray line can help make it feel like it's grounded. So I'm actually probably going to return to these and do that later. But that just looks something like this. And, you know, some illustrators will throw some pebbles or something in there as well, just to give it a little ground. Or you know, for instance, I don't want to start doing grass because I'd probably screw it up, but a lot of these guys are foraging grass. No, I didn't do banding on the wings, so I should do that. And the banding on the secondaries is another one that's very important to count. And it's never, you know, never in a linear line, just paying attention to how it all relates to one another is super important. It's not just, it's very rarely just, you know, a straight line across. They're not all lined up perfectly. So that imperfection actually makes it look correct. And, you know, for one other thing, for Aratus, there's a break in the nape color and the throat color somewhere right here. So I might just map that out just so that I know that for that subspecies, I need to know where that break is. So just figuring that out right now is better than doing it incorrectly. Oh, a tool I forgot at home in my haste to get here was I have a really big brush, a horsehair brush, that I use to clean off all of these pencil or these eraser shavings, and it just keeps things clean, and you also don't smear your pencil. And yeah, that's my northern flicker. Again, this is something you can do if you have, you know, a perched owl would be a fun one. I've used, you know, done it with perched owls, or waterfowl are very confiding, especially, you know, if you're just trying to practice and everything. You can go to a park, a county park that has mallards, or in Boise we have along the river a ton of geese, and they're fun to illustrate. So you can go and get birds that are relatively unmoving or moving slowly, and you can practice this idea of, you know, I want to illustrate a goose from the side profile, so just sitting down in the grass watching geese and slowly putting together a bird. It's a nice way to spend an afternoon. So I hope you can see how I go from this to this. These obviously are not, they're different because this is a different illustration than what I use for these, but I think you can see how I do it now and how you could probably do it yourself. I can see me now. Yeah, and so if anybody has any other questions, I'd be very happy to answer them. Otherwise, I really appreciate the opportunity to share something that I really love doing with you all, and hopefully you all can try it out yourself and find the same satisfaction as I do in it.
And we have some questions coming up.
Cool.
We have a question from Lena. Maybe the black necklace?
Oh, I forgot that. Got me in a mistake. It's very important. The shape of the black necklace is one distinguishing feature from gilded flicker, right? So, well, let me look at my reference material. It's too extensive, I think.
And while you're doing that, I've got another question, one from John Harris. You've been doing this since you were a kid. Any major epiphanies or influences along the way?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything I've talked about tonight has been things I've learned in the last 4 years since I've started doing this on a more professional level, especially the guidebook illustration. That's pushed me to really figure out how to get things more correct. I started drawing birds actually here in Ithaca as a kid, drawing herons. I was obsessed with drawing herons. And I mean, I knew how to make it look like a heron, but I really didn't start figuring out all this feather position and everything like that until a few years ago. I'm of course still having epiphanies about how to do things better. There are so many amazing illustrators out there in the world right now that are far more skilled than I am and are really good for me to pay attention to how they do things and how I might strengthen my illustrations just by emulating them. I wish I could sit down with them and learn about their process. People like Ian Lewington. Ian Lewington's probably my favorite. His illustrations are surreal. They're incredibly artful, but also exact. But I also like John Gale. He's also extremely talented. And I think that I'm also still discovering artists that are out there and aren't well known, but have illustrated prolifically for a lot of guidebooks. Yeah.
So we have 3 questions all about how you transfer your sketch to a painting or watercolor or to watercolor paper or into colored art.
Yeah, I use tracing paper rather than transfer paper because if you're not familiar with transfer paper is on one side it has charcoal on it, and you basically lay it down and you trace it, and then you take it over to your canvas and you trace over what you just traced, and it transfers it using the charcoal onto the page. I use tracing paper and I trace it and I flip it over and trace the tracing on the other side with generally with I'll trace it with a thin pencil and then I'll retrace it on the other side with a thicker one, and then I'll take it to my canvas and then I'll trace it again to transfer that on the other side. So it's essentially I'm making my own transfer paper. The reason I don't use transfer paper is because the entire other side is charcoal, and when you lay it down, if you're trying to make this effect where you have a clean canvas, otherwise when you put that transfer paper down with the charcoal, it's hard not to get the charcoal to mess up the negative space on the page. And charcoal, you can erase it, but sometimes that erasing can make scuffs and stuff, so I just avoid that and spend just a little bit of extra time to basically make my own transfer paper to keep it clean. If I were doing an illustration where I did a background, which I'm terrible at, I need to work on that, I could use transfer paper in those instances, but I generally don't. Does that make sense?
Yes. What mediums do you use to color the birds?
Yeah, I went through a phase of Prismacolor pencils, but I've come away from that. I know Andrew uses, I think, a combination, but he uses a lot of Prismacolor. I've come away from that because I don't know, I felt it was a little bit limiting. Now I use gouache paint, which is what a lot of illustrators use. David Sibley in particular uses gouache. It's if you're not familiar with it, it's a really a neat medium. You can use it like a watercolor, which I most often do, but you can also use less water and more pigment and build like an acrylic, and then put paint on top of it, so you can highlight with a lighter color, which I often do for with white gouache paint, just to give it a sheen or highlight. I haven't really done a lot. I've done that here on the gray, but I could do a lot more. I can actually spend a lot more time with these, refining them, and I might do that. But the other thing I like about gouache is that I can take a wet paintbrush and I can still push paint around, even though I finished painting this days ago and this is all dry. I can reactivate that paint and push it around. So it's in that way, it's fairly forgiving. Yeah, I have painted with acrylic on canvas before, and I wish I was more exploratory these days, but I think my time is so full that I don't just sit down just to explore and have fun. But I'd like to get back into acrylic and then, you know, at some point down the line, I would like to try doing more elaborate paintings with oil, which I've done a little bit of in the past. But for now, illustration will be gouache.
Thank you. And there's one last question from John Dunn. Would the first starting strokes be the body and the head, plus the contour line of where the wing meets the underparts?
So he asked, would that be the first stroke?
Yeah, would the first starting strokes be the body and the head, plus the contour line of where the wing meets the underparts?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. And at some point, I'd like to do, I've done workshops where I do this, and I feel like the feedback is always, well, now we'd like to see you paint. And I really want to do that at some point. But generally, the approach, once you get your drawing transferred, is you do what's called washes. So you wash down these block colors with the secondaries and the mantle and all the covers here. That color, you wash that, basically just put down that first color, and you do the same where you just put down all these block colors, and then you start building dark from there or adding pigment from there to finish the rest. What you want to do last is all the detailing. So on these, I generally stay away from putting any dark black down or the patterning down until the very last, because you first want to make sure you get the shape and contour and everything right before you start putting down finer details, because you can't go back. You can say, if I wanted to make this more shaded and make this darker, you can, but when you put a wet brush over all that detail, it's just going to smudge it all out. So it's better to do that, build the shape and the form of the bird first, and then put in the detail. I hope that makes sense.
It sure does.
Cool.
Well, thank you, everyone, for attending this fantastic workshop. And thank you especially to Bryce for jumping through a bunch of extra hoops to make this happen for us. We all really appreciate it. I learned something about bird anatomy anytime I watch somebody sketch a bird or paint a bird, as you've shown us today. And I think that we can all benefit from that and benefit from trying it ourselves. So thank you again. Our next program tonight is Ed Harper's photo ID panel, which will start at 7 o'clock. So we'll be on a break until then. And thank you all, and hope to see you all later on this evening.
Thanks.